Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure, is sponsored by SJ&L General Contractors. SJ&L General Contractors is licensed in both Alabama and Tennessee. This family-owned business provides mass grading, storm drainage, sewer and concrete improvement, asphalt paving, erosion control, demolition, and heavy hauling. If you're in need of any of these services, you can contact them at 931-433-4660. That is 931-433-4660. If you'd like to be employed by this family-owned company, 3 W's and a dot, sjnl.com, www.sjnl.com. I was lying under a bulldozer, and I was screaming. Now, I hadn't been run over by the bulldozer. I had voluntarily ended up underneath the bulldozer on an isolated farm in Tennessee because I was helping my good friend Jim Beverly work. Jim is a gentleman that went to a church that I used to attend, and he and his wife Carolyn had become surrogate grandparents for several young families at church, and they had helped tend to and raise and pet and spoil all of our children. Jim was a modern-day cowboy. Now, Jim didn't ride a horse. Jim couldn't ride a horse. Jim had 8 different versions of artificial hips. Jim had been diagnosed with some kidney problems, had been, at the time that he died, he was the longest surviving kidney transplant person, if not in the Southeast in America. And Jim owned his own business. He had this gigantic rig, a truck, a repair truck, complete with a welder and a crane and a steel bumper that functioned as an anvil. And he would go out to remote areas and repair heavy equipment. He would work on Caterpillars, front end loaders, knuckle boom loaders, road graders, anything that ran with a diesel engine and was too large to take to the shop. One does not simply get a D8 Caterpillar and take it into the local shop. The shop goes to it. And there's only a few guys who were doing this kind of stuff, and Jim was one of them. Jim had every version of the Louis L'Amour collection and read all those books, and he would get on his horse, and he would go out to these isolated areas. And it doesn't, when a thing quits working, it quits working. And it doesn't matter if it's axle deep in the mud or if it's been setting up so long that the bees have invaded it. By the way, a rosebud torch on a wasp's nest is a thing of sheer poetic beauty. But I had gone with Jim on my day off to help him work on the final drive of a front end loader. And technically, what I was there for was because I was smart enough to swing a sledgehammer and knew I was going to get lunch out of the deal. Not the lunch that we brought, but the lunch on the way home. We would stop at some cool restaurant and Jim would feed me. And I had crawled underneath this front end loader. And it was so tight underneath there that I couldn't wear my cap. I had to turn my cap sideways. Now, I don't usually wear caps. I usually wear hats. But I have an old gray Raiders cap that Chris Luter gave me for my birthday. And I was wearing my Raiders cap with Jim. And I had crawled up under this front end loader with a large wrench and was going to free this bolt up so we could get our work done. And there's no space underneath this thing to move or to raise up. And so I'm underneath this thing, and that's when the screaming started. The screaming started because while I was underneath this thing, something started crawling on my leg, started massaging my inner thigh. Now, I've got some ideas about things that go bump in the night. I love monster movies and love to read scary books. Now, I'm not a slasher guy. I don't care about, people in a hockey mask and people in rubber mask. You just put a good 45 hollow point through them and you end the movie real early. No, what I'm talking about is things that eat people. Vampires, werewolves, shapeshifters, Manitou, Wendigos, Erviles, cave whites, heffalumps, woozles, the predator, the alien. I'm underneath this dozer and something's got my leg and I can't raise up to see what it is. I can't turn my body to see what it is. Something is on me and I can't figure out what it is. And so I'm screaming. Now, what I'm screaming is Jim. I'm yelling, Jim, Jim, Jim. And then I'm yelling for Jim Beverly. But at that point, I wouldn't have cared what Jim showed up. It could have been Jim, James, Jimmy, or Juan. I didn't care because whatever had my leg, I was aware of a couple of things. There's like these axioms that you live by. Number one, without a shadow of a doubt, gospel truth. I knew that there was no reason why my leg was being touched by Jim Beverly. Number two, I knew without a shadow of a doubt, with all the faith I possess, that there's no way Jim Beverly's touching my leg. And so I start screaming for Jim, and then the panic sets in. Oh no, it got Jim first. And now I'm on this isolated hill underneath a bulldozer. Something has killed my friend and eaten him, and now it's going to eat me. And screaming for Jim really shouldn't have panicked me because Jim can't hear. Jim's worked around too many impact wrenches and too many diesel engines. And so I could have been screaming at Jim through a boombox amplifier and he wouldn't have been able to hear me. Eventually, Jim came around to my end of the dozer and ran the kitten off. Yeah. A little cat lived in the barn on this isolated farm on a hilltop in Tennessee and probably had not had human contact in a long time. And it saw me lying underneath the bulldozer and it came over to give me a snuggle. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I don't hate cats. Actually, I love cats. I just can't eat a whole one. But when we got out from under that dozer and it was time for lunch, I put on a big pair of welding gloves. And I lured the cat into my lap with some Cheetos, and then I grabbed it with said welding gloves, walked it over to the fence where those steep Tennessee hills are, and I gave that cat a ride down that hill. And no, they don't always land on their feet. How do you go from a beautiful fall day, helping your friend, learning something cool about diesel equipment, to screaming and panicking? Well, it's called a negative fantasy. You see, sometimes we get in positions, and because of the position that we're in, we can't comprehend, we don't understand what's happening to us. I couldn't raise my head, I couldn't turn, I couldn't look up. And so the thing that was happening to me, I had a context for, and it was inaccurate. It was an interpretation error. You see, there was no monster, there was just a mouser. And because I had this interpretation error, I couldn't comprehend, I didn't have the ability to gather all my information, I panicked. I turned a mouser into a monster. It's called a negative fantasy. It's where I superimpose the worst. I read into what will happen if, what won't happen if. I read into you did this because, or you said that because, and all of a sudden a situation that is not dangerous, a situation that is not threatening, a situation that is not even really negative, because after all, what do cats do? They nuzzle your legs when they can. Now, this cat chose a very poor time and a very poor place to do it, but he was still just being a cat. He wasn't trying to scare me. He wasn't trying to intimidate me. He wasn't trying to hurt me. But because of my interpretation of his actions and me not having a context for them, I come up with this negative fantasy. And most negative fantasies are based in some part, way, shape, or form in fear. And fear. He is a liar. That's what the song says. Fear, he is a liar. You see, we really only have two primary emotions. There's a book that talks about dealing with attachment disorder kids and why they behave the way they behave beyond logic, consequences, and control. is the name of the book, and it says that attachment disorder kids come from such abusive environments that when they try to survive in another environment, they've taken behaviors that was adaptive where they were, and they become maladaptive. We superimpose on their behavior that they are manipulative, oppositional, defiant, and really they're trying to survive. But their survival behavior is rooted in fear, not love. And in this book, Beyond Logic, Consequences, and Control, it postulates there's only two primary emotions, love and fear. Love produces all the good stuff. Love, and a byproduct of loving people or being loving, is joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Love is described in 1 Corinthians 13 as that which is mature. And read that list. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not selfish. Love doesn't boast. Love doesn't keep a record of wrongs, is not easily provoked. Love does all the good stuff, and fear and all the other emotions that you want to come up with are either a byproduct of love or a byproduct of fear. And the bad ones come from fear, and the good ones come from love. And so fear creates these negative fantasies. And fear is a very powerful tool. It's a powerful tool to control people. Read Michael Crichton's fictional novel, State of Fear. And it's absolutely fiction, but it's based in some truths. Read the article, How to Kill 6 Million People. And you'll find that people can be easily controlled, easily manipulated, and easily give up their sensibilities if you can get them into a state of fear or a context of fear. Fear produces bad results. Fear produces dysfunctional behavior. Fear produces jumping to conclusions. Fear produces a breakdown in rational communication. Fear is rooted in the fact that I don't have the ability to perceive the entire context of what's going on, and because of my limited perception, I come up with an interpretation error. And rather than controlling my fear controls me. And it's really not just that simple, that do you control your fear, or does your fear control you? There's this interesting dynamic that's put forth several times in Scripture, that faith and fear have this relationship. That a lot of times people's excuse is we were afraid, but what Scripture actually says is it was because you didn't believe. When the people rebelled at Kadesh Barnea and would not go into the land of Canaan, their excuse was the people are big and the land is dangerous and the cities are big. And they go from the people are big to the people are actually Nephilim. And the Hebrew writer, when he's reviewing their rebellion, says you did not go in because you did not believe. In the Revelation of John, there's a list of people who won't enter heaven, and it says the cowardly and the unbelieving. The two things are linked together. Paul writes to a young preacher and says God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. And knowing that we did not come from the factory with fear. In fact, you only come with two fears. You're born with the fear of loud noises, and you're born with a startle reflex to falling backwards. Other than that, every fear that you have has been taught or chosen or conditioned. And we take the fear, and fear is not always bad. We may talk sometime about when it is good, but when we take fear and we let fear rule our hearts, or we let fear rule our minds because we don't have the ability to rise up and perceive what's actually happening, then fear produces those negative things. And fear comes in a context that says, since I don't understand what's going on, I'll jump to the worst conclusion rather than jumping to the faith conclusion. I don't know what's happening. I can't perceive. I can't understand the context of the sensations that I'm feeling. And so I default to fear, where really we should be defaulting to faith and resting in the assurance that we were not given, we were not designed to have a spirit of fear, an overwhelming sense of fear, but that our modus operandi, what we came from the factory with, was a spirit of power, a spirit of love, and the ability to control ourselves, not let ourselves be controlled by fear. Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. I am your host, Lonnie Jones. My wife Jackie and I moved to the city of Huntsville in 1986 for me to be a youth and family minister. I have been a minister since 1980. I have served in this community as a police chaplain assigned to a SWAT team since 1992, and I've been in private practice as a licensed professional counselor since 1998. I'm also an adventure educator and an avid outdoorsman. I dabble in rock climbing, and I goof around with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Our life has been full of many wonderful experiences, and some just outright adventures. I used to write about those things in a little church bulletin article. So now instead of asking you to read those things, we're just going to talk about them in our podcast. And as we talk about them, we're going to talk about the facts. The facts lead to concepts, and the concepts lead to application. One caveat about the facts is, for the most part, we're going to tell you the facts just as they happened. But every now and then, we're going to tell you the way other people have told us they remember it happening, with a little bit of embellishment. It's all good, clean fun and for educational purposes. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy Keeping Up with Jones.